Welcome to our channel.
Across cities, countries, and quiet corners of the world, welcome to Buried Truths, the channel where forgotten secrets rise and hidden stories refuse to stay buried. I'm Whodunit, your host, and I'm truly glad you're here for tonight's Jessica Fletcher mystery, The Silence Beneath Briarwood. These classic-style tales have a special way of bringing us together, no matter where we're listening from. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you joining us from today? Your city, your country, or simply your corner of the world? I read every one and love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoy thoughtful mysteries, slow-burning suspense, and truths that demand to be uncovered, make sure to subscribe. New mysteries arrive here on Buried Truths every single day. Now pour yourself a warm cup of tea or coffee, get comfortable, and let's step quietly into tonight's story. Chapter 1. A Letter That Should Not Exist. Jessica Fletcher had always believed that words carried weight long after they were written. As a novelist, she trusted language to preserve truth, emotion, and memory long after voices fell silent. Yet on that quiet morning in Cabot Cove, a single letter resting on her writing desk felt heavier than any manuscript she had ever completed. The envelope was plain, cream-colored, unremarkable at first glance. No return address, no decorative flourish, just her name written neatly in dark ink, Jessica Fletcher. The handwriting made her pause. It was precise, disciplined, and faintly familiar, as though her mind recognized it before her reason allowed the thought to fully form. She slit the envelope carefully, the soft rasp of paper unusually loud in the still room. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor, and the steady rhythm of waves against the dock offered their usual comfort. Inside, however, the air seemed to shift as her eyes moved across the page. You once told me the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it is buried. Jessica lowered the letter slightly, her breath caught somewhere between surprise and unease. She had said those words before, many years ago, to a man who had asked questions no one else dared to ask. The name surfaced in her mind with unwelcome clarity. Elias Harrow. She continued reading. I believed you then, I believe you now. And because of that belief, I am reaching out before it is too late. Jessica's fingers tightened around the paper. Elias Harrow had been declared dead nearly 2 decades earlier, the victim of a tragic house fire in the small inland town of Briarwood, Maine. The case had been closed swiftly, too swiftly. She remembered how the official conclusions had never quite aligned with the evidence, how discomfort had lingered long after condolences were offered. The letter continued, the lines growing more urgent. What I uncovered was never meant to see daylight. They ensured that. But secrets rot when sealed too tightly, and the stench has begun to rise again. Jessica stood and crossed to the window, letting the morning light steady her. She had learned over the years that instinct was as valuable as intellect, and her instincts were stirring now, whispering that this was not a prank, nor the misguided effort of an admirer. This was a warning. The final paragraph was shorter, almost restrained. If you receive this, know that my silence was never consent. I trusted the wrong people. I trusted time. Both betrayed me. There was no signature, only a date written faintly in the lower corner. Yesterday. Jessica sat slowly, the letter trembling just slightly in her hands. Yesterday meant someone had posted it recently. Yesterday meant intent, planning, survival. Elias Harrow had been a meticulous historian, devoted to accuracy and documentation. He would not fabricate his own resurrection. If this letter was genuine, and Jessica felt deep within herself that it was, then the past she had reluctantly left behind was no longer content to remain buried. Her thoughts drifted back to Briarwood. She remembered narrow streets lined with solemn clapboard houses, the way conversations stopped when Elias entered a room, how his questions unsettled people who preferred their history unexamined. He had been investigating land records, burial registries, and financial ledgers tied to an old development project. Officially, his work had been dismissed as academic curiosity. Unofficially, it had made people nervous. A soft knock at the door startled her. Seth Hazlitt poked his head inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said cheerfully, then stopped short. "Jessica, you look like you've seen a ghost." "In a manner of speaking," she replied, managing a faint smile. Seth noticed the letter. "Bad news?" "Unfinished news," Jessica said carefully. After Seth left, she folded the letter and placed it inside her handbag, as though proximity might help her better understand it. She knew what she had to do, even if she wished she did not. Some mysteries knock politely, others demand attention. She packed a small suitcase, choosing practical clothes suitable for travel and uncertain weather. As she moved through the familiar rooms of her home, she felt the subtle tension that always accompanied the beginning of an investigation. The awareness that comfort would soon give way to confrontation. At the bus station later that afternoon, Jessica purchased a ticket north. The clerk barely looked up, unaware that the destination printed on the slip of paper marked a return to questions long unanswered. As the bus pulled away from Cabot Cove, Jessica watched the town recede, its familiar landmarks softening into memory. She pressed the letter flat against her palm, as if grounding herself in its reality. If Elias Harrow was alive, then someone had lied. If he was dead, then someone was speaking in his voice. Either way, the truth was no longer content to remain silent. And Jessica Fletcher had never been one to ignore a story that refused to stay finished. Chapter 2. The Town That Learned to Forget. Briarwood announced itself not with a sign, but with a feeling. As the bus slowed along a narrow tree-lined road, Jessica Fletcher sensed the quiet resistance of a town that preferred not to be disturbed. Pines leaned inward, their branches knitting a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into thin, watchful beams. When the bus doors hissed open, only Jessica stepped down. The driver waited a moment, as if expecting her to change her mind. She didn't. The town centre consisted of a modest square bordered by a diner, a hardware store, a closed cinema, and a brick municipal building whose windows reflected the sky without revealing anything of what lay inside. Nothing about Briarwood appeared hostile. And yet, the stillness felt rehearsed, as though everyone had agreed to pause their lives until the visitor moved on. Jessica adjusted her coat and wheeled her suitcase toward the Briarwood Inn. The building was old but well kept, its white siding freshly painted, its porch carefully swept. A wooden plaque near the door proclaimed, "Established 1894, a quiet boast of endurance." Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and brewed tea. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her late 50s with ash-blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked up as Jessica approached, her expression shifting subtly from politeness to recognition. "You must be Mrs. Fletcher," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jessica replied evenly. "I have a reservation." The woman nodded, retrieving a key from a rack behind her. "Margaret Lowe," she said. "I run the inn." Jessica accepted the key and studied Margaret's face. There was tension there, carefully disguised behind practiced hospitality. "It's been a while since we've had an author in Briarwood," Margaret added. "Last time was, well, some years ago." "Yes," Jessica said gently. "I remember." Margaret's fingers tightened briefly on the ledger before she let go. "Your room is upstairs. Second door on the left." Jessica thanked her and climbed the narrow staircase. The room was tidy, sparsely decorated, and overlooked the square. From the window she could see a man across the street pause mid-step, glance upward, then quickly move on. She unpacked slowly, listening to the muted sounds of the town. A door closing, a car starting, voices lowering when she passed beneath the window. Briarwood was aware of her presence, and it did not welcome reminders. Her first stop was the local library. The building sat slightly apart from the square, a two-story structure of dark brick softened by ivy. Inside, the scent of aging paper greeted her like an old acquaintance. The librarian looked up from behind the desk, surprise flickering across his features. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "I didn't expect to see you again." "Neither did I, Thomas," Jessica replied. Thomas Bell had been a junior archivist when Elias Harrow worked here. Now his hair was streaked with grey, and responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. "You're here about him," Thomas said quietly, already unlocking the door to the restricted stacks. "I'm here because of him," Jessica corrected. Among the shelves Elias had once catalogued, time felt suspended. Jessica traced a finger along the spines, noting his meticulous system still in place. "He was relentless," Thomas said, "always digging, always cross-referencing. He found discrepancies others missed or ignored." "And when he died?" Jessica asked. Thomas exhaled slowly. The town wanted closure. Questions threatened that. They stopped beside a narrow table cluttered with old files. Thomas lowered his voice. There were rumors he'd uncovered something involving land deeds, old ones, before zoning laws, before records were properly managed. "Managed," Jessica repeated. "He requested documents that had never been publicly accessed," Thomas continued. "After the fire, those requests disappeared." Jessica felt a familiar tightening of resolve. People don't erase records unless they're afraid of what they reveal. Thomas nodded but said nothing more. Outside, dusk settled quickly. As Jessica left the library, she noticed the same man from earlier standing near the diner. He pretended to study the menu, but his eyes followed her reflection in the glass. She walked instead toward the edge of town, where memory guided her feet. The Harrow house had once stood near a small wooded rise overlooking the river. She remembered its sloping roof, the way Elias kept his windows lit late into the night. Now there was nothing. In its place lay a fenced memorial garden, overgrown but deliberately maintained. A bronze plaque bore Elias Harrow's name and the dates of his birth and supposed death. Jessica knelt to examine the soil, fresh enough to have been disturbed recently. Unusual for a memorial few claimed to visit. A groundskeeper appeared suddenly behind her. "Can I help you?" "I'm paying my respects," Jessica said, rising calmly. He shifted uncomfortably. Best to let the past rest. Jessica met his eyes. The past doesn't rest when it's been lied to. That evening, back at the inn, Margaret Lowe watched Jessica from the doorway of the dining room. "You're stirring old things," Margaret said softly. "Old things have a habit of resurfacing," Jessica replied. Margaret turned away without answering. From her room, Jessica looked out at the darkened square. Somewhere in Briarwood, someone was listening, watching, waiting. The town had learned to forget. Jessica had come to remember. Chapter 3, Ashes that Refused to Settle Morning. Arrived in Briarwood under a low ceiling of cloud, the kind that pressed gently but insistently against the mind. Jessica Fletcher welcomed the heaviness. It sharpened her focus. Truth, she had learned, often emerged more clearly when the atmosphere grew uncomfortable. She began the day with a visit to a man few in town spoke about anymore, Leonard Pike, the retired fire marshal who had overseen the investigation into the blaze that supposedly claimed Elias Harrow's life. His name had surfaced repeatedly in old reports Jessica had reviewed the night before, each mention carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had done his job and wanted the matter finished. Leonard lived on the outskirts of Briarwood in a weathered bungalow bordered by scrub grass and rusting garden tools. When he answered the door, he looked surprised, then wary, his lined face tightening as recognition dawned. "I wondered if you'd come," he said at last. Jessica stepped inside, noting the framed commendations on the wall, the photographs of fires extinguished long ago. The living room smelled faintly of wood smoke and menthol. "You ruled the Harrow fire accidental," Jessica said gently. Leonard nodded. "That's what the final report says." "And what did the fire tell you?" she asked. He hesitated, then reached for a battered folder on the coffee table. Inside were copies of photographs and notes that had never made it into the official record. "Fires speak," Leonard said quietly, "if you know how to listen." He laid out the images one by one. The burn patterns were irregular, too concentrated in certain areas. The damage moved unnaturally fast for an electrical malfunction. "There was an accelerant," Leonard admitted, "traces of one anyway. But the samples went missing before lab confirmation." "Went missing?" Jessica echoed. Leonard's jaw tightened. "Orders came down. Close the case. No delays." Jessica studied a photograph of the cellar entrance, blackened but structurally intact. "This wasn't a man trapped by circumstance," she said. "This was a man targeted." Leonard looked away. "I should have pushed harder." "Perhaps you're doing so now," Jessica said kindly. Leaving Leonard's home, Jessica felt the familiar weight of confirmation. Doubt had given way to direction. Elias Harrow had not died in that fire, at least not the way the town claimed. Her next stop was the county records office, housed in the same municipal building that dominated the square. The clerk on duty, a young woman named Denise, offered a polite smile that faltered when Jessica requested archival land documents. "Those files are restricted," Denise said. "They're part of an ongoing review." "By whom?" Jessica asked. Denise shifted uncomfortably. "The council." Jessica thanked her and stepped aside, observing as a middle-aged man emerged from a back office carrying a box labeled Harrow, closed. He froze when he saw her. "You weren't supposed to find this," he blurted out, then flushed deeply. Jessica recognized him as Peter Caldwell, a former council aide whose name appeared in Elias's notes. "Find what?" she asked calmly. Caldwell swallowed. "Nothing. Just routine transfers." "Routine transfers don't require secrecy," Jessica replied. He said nothing more, retreating hastily. That afternoon, Jessica returned to the memorial garden. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the bronze plaque with ironic clarity. She noticed again the disturbed soil near the fence, fresher than before. A maintenance worker trimmed hedges nearby, his movements tense. "Has anyone authorized recent work here?" Jessica asked. He shook his head. "Not officially." Jessica waited until evening fell and the town quieted. She returned with a small spade, borrowed from the inn's shed. The earth yielded easily beneath her careful strokes. The sound of metal against soil sent a chill through her. Jessica brushed away dirt, revealing the corner of a small, fire-scorched lockbox. Her pulse quickened as she lifted it free. The latch resisted briefly before giving way. Inside lay folded documents wrapped in oilcloth, land deeds dating back decades, financial ledgers stamped with municipal seals, handwritten annotations in Elias Harrow's precise script. One page stood apart, It was a sworn statement, notarized and dated 2 days before the fire. If anything happens to me, it will not be accidental. The evidence I have gathered implicates members of the Briarwood Council in falsifying land ownership records and concealing human remains uncovered during development. Jessica closed the box slowly, absorbing the gravity of what she held. Elias had anticipated his own erasure and planned accordingly. As she replaced the soil carefully, a twig snapped behind her. "Looking for something?" a voice asked. Jessica turned to see Margaret Lowe standing just beyond the fence, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Only the truth," Jessica replied evenly. Margaret's gaze dropped briefly to the ground, then returned. "Some truths burn hotter than fires," she said softly. "And yet," Jessica said, "ashes remember." Margaret said nothing more, turning away and disappearing into the dark. Back at the inn, Jessica locked her door and spread the documents across the bed. Patterns emerged quickly, names repeated, signatures forged, funds redirected. Elias Harrow had not been chasing shadows. He had uncovered a structure built on deliberate deception. The town had tried to bury the evidence. It had failed. As Jessica packed the lockbox back into her bag, the telephone rang sharply, slicing through the silence. She lifted the receiver. "This is Fletcher," a familiar voice whispered. "They know you're there." Her heart steadied rather than raced. "Elias," she said. The line crackled, then went dead. Jessica replaced the receiver slowly. The fire had not ended the story. It had only marked the point where it began to smolder. Chapter 4. The Voice That Survived the Fire. Sleep eluded Jessica Fletcher that night. The events of the day replayed themselves with stubborn clarity. The fire marshal's quiet confession, the buried lockbox, the unmistakable sound of Elias Harrow's voice traveling across decades of presumed death. When dawn finally filtered through the thin curtains of her room at the Briarwood Inn, she rose without fatigue. Resolve had replaced rest. She reviewed the documents once more, memorizing names, dates, and connections. Elias had been methodical to the last, anticipating discovery and protecting his findings with care. What struck Jessica most was not the scope of the deception, but the restraint with which he had pursued it. He had sought truth, not spectacle. At precisely 8 o'clock, the telephone rang. Jessica answered immediately. "I couldn't call sooner," Elias said. His voice sounded older now, worn by years of concealment, but unmistakably alive. "The lines here aren't secure." "Where are you?" Jessica asked. "Close enough to watch them repeat the same mistakes," he replied, too far to intervene directly. Jessica closed her eyes briefly. "You survived the fire." "Yes," Elias said. "Barely. And not without help." He explained in careful detail. The night of the blaze, he had been working late, aware that his research had attracted attention he did not welcome. When he smelled smoke, it was already too late for coincidence. He escaped through a narrow cellar tunnel originally dug as a drainage channel decades earlier, emerging near the river with burns and smoke-filled lungs. "A nurse named Helen Carter found me," Elias said. "She understood immediately that I couldn't go to the hospital. She helped me disappear." "And the town accepted your death without question," Jessica said. "Acceptance was encouraged," Elias replied. "Paperwork was expedited. Doubts were smothered." Jessica thought of Leonard Pike and his missing evidence. "Why contact me now?" "Because they're building again," Elias said. "On the same land, using the same falsified records. And this time they're destroying what remains." Jessica felt the urgency sharpen. "You have more evidence?" "Yes," Elias said. "But not enough to act alone. I needed someone they couldn't intimidate. Someone who understands how lies unravel." Jessica allowed herself a small, grim smile. You chose well. The line disconnected abruptly. Later that morning, Jessica attended the weekly town council meeting, choosing visibility over secrecy. The room fell quiet as she entered, recognition spreading like a ripple through the assembled residents. Councilman Richard Dane presided with forced cheer. He spoke at length about economic revitalization, about opportunity and progress. His words were polished, practiced, and hollow. When the floor opened for questions, Jessica stood. "Could you clarify the origins of the Riverside Development land?" she asked calmly. Dane's smile stiffened. "Those records have been reviewed thoroughly." "By the same council members whose signatures appear on these?" Jessica asked, producing copies from the lockbox. A murmur swept the room. Margaret Lowe sat rigidly in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dane's voice hardened. "Mrs. Fletcher, this is inappropriate." "Truth often is," Jessica replied. The meeting adjourned abruptly. As people filed out, Thomas Bell approached her, his face pale. "I didn't know how bad it was," he whispered. "Elias trusted me with fragments. I thought I was protecting the town." "Protecting lies protects no one," Jessica said gently. That afternoon, Jessica visited Helen Carter's former residence, guided by a lead from Elias's notes. The house was empty now, its windows boarded, its garden overgrown. Inside, dust-coated, forgotten furniture. In a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard, Jessica found medical records documenting Elias's injuries and recovery, proof of survival, carefully preserved. As she left the house, a car pulled alongside her. Richard Dane leaned out the window. "You should leave Briarwood," he said quietly, "for your own good." Jessica met his gaze steadily. "You're afraid?" she said. Dane's expression flickered. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "I have every idea," Jessica replied. "And so do you." That evening, Jessica returned to her room to find the door ajar. Inside, drawers had been rifled through, papers scattered. Nothing was taken. It was a message. The phone rang moments later. "They're panicking," Elias said. "That makes them dangerous." "Then we must be precise," Jessica replied. She spent the night organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative, anticipating denial, deflection, and accusation. Truth, she knew, required structure to withstand pressure. Outside, Briarwood lay restless. Lights burned late in council offices. Voices rose and fell behind closed doors. The fire that was meant to erase Elias Harrow had failed. Now its embers threatened to ignite something far more destructive for those who had believed themselves untouchable. Jessica Fletcher sharpened her resolve. The past had spoken, the present was listening, and soon it would be forced to answer. Chapter 5. When motives begin to surface. By the fifth morning in Briarwood, the town no longer pretended Jessica Fletcher was merely a visitor. Her presence had become a disruption, an uninvited reminder that the past could not be negotiated into silence. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Doors closed more carefully. Even the air itself felt cautious, as though words carried consequences. Jessica welcomed the shift. Resistance meant pressure, and pressure revealed fractures. She began the day at the diner overlooking the square, a modest place with cracked vinyl booths and a bell that rang whenever the door opened. Coffee was poured without comment, but curiosity hummed beneath the surface. From her seat, Jessica observed the rhythm of the town, who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact, who watched the door too closely. Richard Dane arrived mid-morning, removing his coat with deliberate ease. He noticed Jessica immediately and chose the booth behind her. His voice carried just enough to be heard. "This town doesn't need excavation," he said to no one in particular. "It needs forward motion." Jessica stirred her coffee slowly, listening. Dane continued, "People dig too deeply and forget how fragile progress can be." The waitress glanced nervously toward Jessica, then hurried away. After Dane left, Margaret Lowe entered, her expression strained. She hesitated before approaching Jessica's table. "I need to speak with you," Margaret said quietly. They stepped outside, the cool air carrying the scent of wet leaves. Margaret's composure cracked almost immediately. "My father was on the council," she said. "Years ago, he signed those documents." Jessica nodded. "Did he know they were falsified?" Margaret swallowed. "He convinced himself they were harmless, that no one would be hurt." "And when Elias Harrow found the truth?" Jessica asked. Margaret's eyes filled. "My father panicked. He wasn't strong enough to stop what followed." "Did he start the fire?" Jessica asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "No, but he didn't stop it." That distinction weighed heavily between them. Jessica's next visit was to Thomas Bell, who had agreed to speak openly, at last. In the quiet of the library's back office, he confessed to altering records under pressure. "They threatened to ruin me," he said. "Career, reputation, everything." "And now?" Jessica asked. Thomas straightened. "Now I'm tired of being afraid." He handed her a folder containing correspondence between council members, emails, letters, coded references to clearance and containment. Together they formed a damning mosaic. By afternoon, the sheriff requested a meeting. Sheriff Alan Crowley was a pragmatic man, cautious by nature. He listened as Jessica laid out the evidence, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted, "but without a living witness." "I have one," Jessica said. Crowley's eyes widened. "You're certain?" "Yes," Jessica replied, "and he's willing to come forward." Outside the station, Jessica felt the tension crest. Truth was no longer theoretical, it was advancing. That evening she received another call from Elias. "They're turning on each other," he said. "Dane is isolating himself." "Fear does that," Jessica replied. "It clarifies priorities." As night fell, a scream shattered the quiet near the river. News spread quickly. Richard Dane had been found face down near the embankment, his body caught among the reeds. The water was high from recent rain, the current deceptive. The sheriff cordoned off the area as townspeople gathered in hushed clusters. Margaret Lowe stood pale and trembling. Thomas Bell avoided everyone's gaze. Jessica approached the sheriff. "Accident?" she asked softly. Crowley shook his head. "Too soon to tell." Jessica studied the scene. The ground was slick, but showed signs of struggle, not violent, desperate. Dane's phone lay nearby, its screen shattered. Fear, Jessica knew, had finally overtaken him. As the body was removed, Jessica felt the weight of inevitability. When long-buried lies surface, they rarely do so gently. Briarwood's reckoning had entered its most dangerous phase, and the truth, once stirred, would not retreat. Chapter 6. Death does not always silence. The river had returned to its usual calm by morning, as though it had nothing to confess. Mist hovered above the surface, softening the banks and blurring the place where Richard Dane's life had ended. Briarwood, however, was far from peaceful. Fear moved through the town in quiet currents, settling behind drawn curtains and closed doors. Jessica Fletcher stood near the cordoned area as the sheriff's deputies finished their preliminary work. Sheriff Alan Crowley looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "No sign of robbery," he said. "Wallet's intact. Phone smashed, but deliberately." "Deliberately?" Jessica asked. Crowley nodded. Impact alone wouldn't have done that. Jessica gazed at the water. Then he wanted something destroyed or hidden. The sheriff exhaled slowly, or he didn't want it found. By late morning, the official word circulated: Richard Dane's death was under investigation, but no evidence of homicide had yet been established. The phrasing was careful, non-committal, meant to calm a town already bracing for scandal. Jessica knew better. Accidents born of desperation carried their own signatures. She returned to the inn where Margaret Lowe sat alone in the dining room, untouched breakfast cooling in front of her. Her eyes were red, her posture rigid. "Less saying I argued with him," Margaret said without looking up, "as if that makes me responsible." "Did you?" Jessica asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "I confronted him last night. I told him I wouldn't stay silent anymore." "And how did he respond?" "He laughed," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Said the town would swallow any version of the truth he fed it." Jessica rested a hand lightly on the table. "What happened after?" "He stormed off toward the river. I followed part way, shouting. Then he slipped. I reached for him, but he pulled away." Tears spilled freely now. The water was rising. He lost his footing. "Did you push him?" Jessica asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "No, I could have saved him if he hadn't panicked." Panic. Again. Jessica left Margaret to the quiet of her grief and went to the sheriff's station. There she reviewed the contents of Dane's recovered phone backup, messages retrieved from cloud storage, overlooked in his haste to destroy the device itself. The messages told a story of increasing isolation. Dane had been skimming development funds, diverting money into personal accounts, while threatening to expose other council members if they interfered. The lies had begun to collapse inward, turning ally against ally. "He was playing everyone," Crowley said grimly. And when he realized the game was over, he ran, Jessica finished. By afternoon, the coroner's report confirmed drowning, no blunt force trauma, no defensive wounds. An accident, yes, but one engineered by years of deceit. Jessica requested one final meeting at the town hall. The council chamber filled slowly, residents drawn by curiosity, anger, and exhaustion. Sheriff Crowley stood at the back. Thomas Bell sat stiffly, his confession already submitted. Margaret Lowe remained absent. Jessica stepped forward. "Richard Dane did not die because he was exposed," she said calmly. "He died because he believed control was his only protection." She laid out the evidence methodically: financial records, falsified deeds, hidden correspondence. She explained how fear had bound the council together and how fear had eventually torn it apart. "This town was not built on malice," Jessica continued. "It was built on compromise, and compromise left unchecked became corruption." A murmur rippled through the room. Not denial, but recognition. At the back, a door opened. Elias Harrow stepped inside. The room froze. He looked older, thinner, marked by time and concealment. But his eyes were clear. "I never wanted this," Elias said quietly. "I wanted correction, not catastrophe." Gasps followed. Some people wept, others stared, stunned. Sheriff Crowley moved forward, stunned but resolute. "Mr. Harrow, you're alive." "Yes," Elias replied, "and ready to testify." The meeting dissolved into chaos, but something fundamental shifted. The truth was no longer abstract. It had a face. That evening, as Briarwood settled into an uneasy calm, Jessica walked once more to the river. The water reflected the fading light, indifferent yet honest. Death, she reflected, did not always silence. Sometimes it forced the living to listen. And Briarwood was finally hearing what it had tried so long to ignore. Chapter 7. The Weight of What Survives. Briarwood awoke the morning after Elias Harrow's return as though the town itself had drawn a cautious breath. The familiar routines resumed. Shops opened, cars rolled through the square, coffee steamed behind diner windows, but nothing felt ordinary. The past had stepped into the present, and no one could pretend otherwise. Jessica Fletcher watched the square from her window at the inn, noting the way people gathered in small clusters, voices lowered, expressions tense but strangely relieved. Revelation carried fear, but it also carried release. Secret demanded energy to maintain. Now that burden had shifted, Elias Harrow remained under protective custody at the sheriff's request, not because he had committed any crime, but because years of deception had left unpredictable edges behind. Jessica visited him that afternoon in a quiet room at the station. "You look well," she said, meaning it. "Well enough to finish what I started," Elias replied. His voice lacked bitterness. If anything, it held fatigue and a certain clarity that comes when survival outlasts fear. "They're reopening everything," Jessica said. "Land deeds, financial records, the burial site." Elias nodded. That land was never empty. It was treated as though history began only when it became profitable. Jessica thought of the names in his ledgers, the careful documentation of what had been erased. "You protected the truth when it was dangerous to do so." "I protected evidence," Elias corrected. "Truth survives on its own." Outside the station, reporters had begun to arrive, drawn by whispers and leaked information. Sheriff Crowley moved swiftly to maintain order, issuing statements that acknowledged investigation without feeding speculation. Still, Briarwood's isolation had ended. That evening, a community forum convened in the high school gymnasium. Folding chairs filled the space, and faces once familiar in passing now carried shared uncertainty. Jessica sat near the front, beside Thomas Bell, who clutched his notes with trembling hands. Margaret Lowe entered late, her expression resolute despite exhaustion. She took a seat alone. Sheriff Crowley opened the forum. "We're here to address what's been uncovered and what happens next." One by one, people spoke. Anger surfaced, shame followed. Then grief. Grief for trust misplaced, for voices ignored, for a town that had believed silence equaled safety. Thomas stood. "I helped hide records," he said, his voice breaking. "Not because I believed the lie, but because I feared its consequences." No one interrupted. Margaret rose next. "My father chose loyalty over honesty," she said, "and I chose silence until it was no longer possible." Jessica listened, understanding that confession was not absolution, but it was a beginning. Elias addressed the room last. "I disappeared because I believed the truth needed time," he said. "I was wrong. Truth needs courage." The gym fell silent. Outside, night settled gently. The forum ended without applause, without resolution, only a shared acknowledgement that repair would be slow and necessary. In the days that followed, state investigators arrived. Construction halted. The land near the river was cordoned off, and archaeologists confirmed what Elias had documented long ago. The remains found were treated with respect long overdue. Jessica prepared to leave Briarwood, her work done. On her final morning, she walked once more through the memorial garden. Workers had removed the plaque. In its place stood an empty space, waiting to be redefined. Elias joined her, leaning lightly on a cane. "They'll want me to stay," he said, "to help rebuild." "And will you?" Jessica asked. "Yes," he replied, this time openly. Jessica smiled. "Then Briarwood may yet learn that truth is not a threat." As she boarded the bus, Jessica glanced back at the town. It looked smaller now, not diminished, but clarified. Some towns buried their histories, others learned to carry them, Briarwood, at last, had chosen the latter, and Jessica Fletcher carried with her the quiet certainty that some stories, once spoken, heal not by ending, but by continuing. Chapter 8. What Remains After Truth? Cabot. Cove welcomed Jessica Fletcher home with the familiar grace of a place that asked nothing of her beyond presence. The harbour shimmered beneath a pale afternoon sun, gulls tracing lazy arcs above the water, as though nothing beyond the tide had ever demanded attention. Jessica paused at the gate of her home, suitcase in hand, allowing the contrast to settle. Briarwood's reckoning felt distant now, but not diminished. Inside, the house greeted her with silence that was not emptiness, but completion. She set her bag down and moved instinctively toward her writing desk. The letter from Elias Harrow, carefully folded, waited where she had left it, a reminder of how quietly some journeys begin. Jessica brewed a pot of tea and sat, fingers resting lightly on the typewriter keys. She did not rush. Some conclusions required reflection, not urgency. In Briarwood, the truth had emerged at a cost, reputations dismantled, trust strained, grief unearthed. Yet something else had surfaced alongside it, responsibility. The town would not return to innocence, but it might reach integrity. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Seth Hazlitt entered with his customary blend of curiosity and concern. "You look like someone who's finished a long chapter," he said. "Finished, perhaps," Jessica replied. "Resolved, certainly." Over tea, she told him what she could, of Elias's survival, of corruption born from fear, of a death that was not murder, but not meaningless either. "Sounds like the truth didn't come gently," Seth said. "It rarely does," Jessica replied. "But it does come." That evening, Jessica returned to her desk. The typewriter hummed softly as she began to write. Not a novel, not yet, but a record. Names, dates, context. Truth preserved not for drama, but for memory. She thought of Elias, rebuilding his life in the open at last. Of Margaret Lowe, learning that inheritance included accountability. Of Thomas Bell, choosing integrity over protection. Truth, Jessica reflected, was not a verdict. It was a mirror. Weeks passed. Briarwood appeared occasionally in the news, quiet updates, measured language, progress without spectacle. Jessica followed these developments with interest, not attachment. Her role had been to illuminate, not to linger. One afternoon, a letter arrived. This one bore a return address. "Dear Jessica, the work continues. It's difficult, humbling, and necessary. Thank you for reminding us that survival is not the same as living honestly." Elias Jessica smiled, folding the letter carefully and placing it in her desk drawer beside others like it. Testaments to stories concluded but not forgotten. As autumn deepened, she began a new manuscript, not about Briarwood specifically, but about the fragile architecture of trust and how easily it collapsed when built on silence. Outside, leaves fell with quiet certainty, unafraid of ending, because they understood renewal. Jessica typed the final line of the day and paused, gazing out the window toward the harbour. Truth did not erase the past. It reframed it. Some mysteries ended with justice, others ended with understanding. The most enduring ones ended with responsibility. Jessica Fletcher closed the typewriter, satisfied. The story had been told. What remained was the work of living with it, and, when necessary, having the courage to tell it again.
Thank you for spending this time with me and for stepping into tonight's mystery here on Buried Truths. It truly means so much to share these stories with listeners from all across the world. If this mystery kept you thinking, stirred your curiosity, or stayed with you after the final words, Please take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach others who love thoughtful mysteries just as much as you do. And if you have not already subscribed to Buried Truths and turn on notifications, new mysteries, hidden histories, and buried secrets await you here every single day. Let me know in the comments what you thought of tonight's story and where you are listening from. I read every comment and I love hearing from you. Until next time, stay curious and remember some truths may be buried, but they never stay silent forever. Good night and see you in the next mystery.